Marcus Chen had always been the kind of person who noticed things others missed. Growing up in the sprawling megacity of New Shanghai, he learned early that survival often depended on paying attention to the small details. The way someone walked could tell you if they were carrying weapons. The sound of footsteps could reveal whether someone was following you. And, sometimes, if you were really paying attention, you could spot someone who needed help. That particular skill had served him well during his 5 years working as a maintenance engineer aboard the massive trading station Nexus Prime. The station sat at the intersection of 7 major hyperspace routes, making it one of the busiest commercial hubs in the galaxy. Every day, thousands of beings from hundreds of different species passed through its corridors. Traders, diplomats, tourists, refugees, criminals, and everything in between mixed together in a chaotic symphony of galactic life. Marcus had seen it all. He had watched Zephyrian merchants haggle over the price of crystal formations that could power entire cities. He had observed Ketheri diplomats conduct negotiations through complex dances that could last for days. He had even helped evacuate an entire section when a plasma bear somehow escaped from a cargo hold and went on a rampage through the food courts. But, despite all the excitement and danger that came with life on Nexus Prime, Marcus found himself drawn to the quieter moments. The times when he could sit in one of the observation decks and watch the stars drift by. The moments when he could grab a simple meal and just think about life. And, especially the opportunities to help someone who needed it, even if it was just a small gesture. That's exactly what led to the most important moment of his life, though he wouldn't realize it until much later. Marcus had just finished a 12-hour shift replacing atmospheric processors in Section C. The work was exhausting, requiring him to crawl through maintenance tunnels barely wide enough for a human body while wearing a full environmental suit. His back ached, his hands were cramped from wielding tools in zero gravity, and all he wanted was to find somewhere quiet to eat the protein bar he had been saving for the end of his shift. He found himself in one of the lesser-known observation lounges on level 47. Most beings avoided this particular area because the artificial gravity generators in this section had a slight wobble that made some species nauseous. For humans, it was barely noticeable, just a gentle swaying sensation like being on a boat. Marcus actually found it soothing. The lounge was dimly lit, with large transparent aluminum windows that offered an unobstructed view of the Kepler Nebula. Streams of purple and gold gas swirled in cosmic patterns that seemed to dance in the light of nearby stars. Marcus had been coming to this spot for 3 years, and he never got tired of the view. As he settled into his favorite chair near the largest window, Marcus noticed he wasn't alone. An elderly female figure sat hunched in a corner booth, partially hidden in the shadows. At first glance, she appeared almost human, but Marcus's trained eye caught the subtle differences that marked her as something else. Her skin had a faint blue-green tint, barely visible in the low light. Her ears were slightly pointed, and her eyes seemed larger than they should be. She wore simple gray robes that looked like they had seen better days, and she sat very still, staring out at the nebula with an expression Marcus couldn't quite read. What really caught his attention, though, was how thin she looked. In the 3 years he had been coming to this lounge, Marcus had developed an eye for recognizing different types of beings who passed through Nexus Prime. He could usually tell the difference between someone who was naturally thin and someone who was thin because they weren't getting enough to eat. This elderly alien woman definitely fell into the latter category. Marcus pulled out his protein bar and unwrapped it slowly, the familiar smell of chocolate and nutrients filling his nostrils. It was a good one, too, not like the cheap synthetic bars they sold in the station's vending machines. This was real Earth chocolate mixed with actual protein cultures, something he had been saving for a particularly difficult day. And, today definitely qualified. He took a bite and savored the rich flavor, but, as he chewed, he found his eyes drifting back to the elderly alien woman. She hadn't moved since he arrived, and he began to wonder when she had last eaten. Station regulations required all visitors to have proof of financial resources or a sponsor before being allowed aboard, but Marcus had seen enough to know that regulations didn't always prevent people from falling through the cracks. The woman shifted slightly, and Marcus caught a glimpse of her face in the reflected light from the nebula. She looked tired, not just physically but in a deeper way that spoke of long years and heavy burdens. Her large eyes held a sadness that reminded Marcus of his grandmother back on Earth, who had lived through the resource wars and carried their memory with her until the day she died. Marcus made a decision that would change everything, though at the time it seemed like the smallest possible gesture. He stood up, walked over to the elderly woman's booth, and gently cleared his throat. She looked up at him with those large, sad eyes, and he could see wariness there, as if she was expecting trouble. "Excuse me," Marcus said softly, speaking in Standard Galactic, the common trade language used throughout the stations. "I noticed you've been sitting here for a while, and I thought you might be hungry. Would you like to share this protein bar with me? It's chocolate flavored, from Earth. Pretty good stuff." The alien woman stared at him for a long moment, and Marcus began to wonder if he had made a mistake. Maybe she didn't eat the same types of food as humans. Maybe offering food was considered offensive in her culture. Maybe she thought he was trying to poison her or con her somehow. But then she spoke, and her voice was like music, soft and melodic with an accent he couldn't place. "You would share your food with a stranger?" "Sure," Marcus said with a shrug. "I mean, it's just a protein bar. I've got a whole box of them back in my quarters. And you look like you could use a good meal." The woman studied his face for another long moment, as if she was trying to read something written there in a language she didn't quite understand. Finally, she nodded slowly. "That is very kind of you, young human. I would be honored to share your meal." Marcus broke the protein bar in half and handed her the larger piece, then sat down across from her. She examined the bar carefully before taking a small bite. Her eyes widened slightly, and she smiled for the first time since he had noticed her. "This is quite good," she said. "It has been some time since I tasted chocolate from Earth." "You've had Earth chocolate before?" Marcus asked, surprised. "That stuff is pretty expensive out here in the outer systems. The shipping costs alone." "I have traveled extensively in my time," the woman said simply. "I have tasted many foods from many worlds." They ate in comfortable silence for a while, watching the nebula swirl outside the windows. Marcus found himself stealing glances at his dining companion, trying to figure out what species she belonged to. Her features were similar to several different humanoid races he knew, but not quite matching any of them perfectly. It was as if she was something entirely unique, or perhaps so old that she predated the classification systems he was familiar with. "What is your name, kind human?" she asked eventually. "Marcus Chen. I'm a maintenance engineer here on the station. Been working here about 5 years now." "What about you?" "You may call me Vera," she said. "I am between destinations, you might say. Waiting for transportation to become available." Marcus nodded. He had met plenty of travelers who were stuck on Nexus Prime waiting for ships or dealing with travel documentation issues. The bureaucracy involved in interstellar travel could be a nightmare, especially for beings who weren't familiar with the constantly changing regulations. "Where are you trying to get to?" he asked. "Maybe I can help you figure out the transport schedules. I know most of the shipping companies that operate out of here." Vera smiled again, and Marcus noticed that her expression seemed somehow ancient, as if she carried the weight of centuries behind those large eyes. "That is very thoughtful of you, Marcus Chen. But I suspect my destination is not served by commercial shipping lines. Private transport, then? That can be expensive, but if you know the right people." "Money is not the issue," Vera said quietly. "It is more a matter of timing. Certain things must happen in their proper order." Marcus didn't quite understand what she meant by that, but he had learned not to pry too deeply into other beings' personal business. Life on a trading station meant encountering all sorts of complicated situations, and sometimes it was better to just offer help without asking too many questions. They finished eating the protein bar, and Marcus found himself reluctant to leave. There was something about Vera that made him want to stay and talk, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. Maybe it was the way she listened when he spoke, as if his words actually mattered. Maybe it was the sadness in her eyes that reminded him of his grandmother. Or maybe it was just the simple pleasure of sharing a meal with someone who appreciated the gesture. "Thank you for sharing your food with me," Vera said as she carefully brushed crumbs from her robes. "It has been a long time since someone showed me such kindness without expecting anything in return." "Don't mention it," Marcus said. "I mean, it was just a protein bar. Nothing special." Vera tilted her head and looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "I think you would be surprised, Marcus Chen, at how special simple kindness can be. Especially in a galaxy that often seems to have forgotten the value of such things." She started to stand up, moving slowly as if her joints ached. Marcus jumped up to help her, offering his arm for support. She accepted it gratefully, and he was struck by how light she seemed, as if she was made of something more fragile than bone and flesh. "Will you be all right?" he asked. "Do you have a place to stay? The station has some emergency shelters if you need them." "I will manage," Vera said. "But, thank you for your concern. It means more than you know." She started to walk away, then paused and turned back to him. "Marcus Chen, may I ask you something?" "Sure. In your experience, what do you think makes a being worthy of power? Of responsibility over others?" The question caught Marcus off guard. It seemed oddly philosophical for casual conversation, but he could tell from Vera's expression that she was genuinely interested in his answer. Marcus thought about it for a moment, considering his experiences working on the station. He had dealt with beings from dozens of species, from lowly cargo handlers to wealthy merchants to high-ranking government officials. He had seen the best and worst of galactic society. "I guess," he said slowly, "I think it comes down to whether someone uses their power to help others or just to help themselves. I've seen plenty of beings who had authority because they were rich or came from important families, but they didn't really care about anyone except themselves. And I've seen others who didn't have much power at all, but they used what little they had to make things better for the people around them." Vera nodded slowly, as if his answer confirmed something she had already suspected. "And what about you, Marcus Chen? If you had great power, great responsibility, what would you do with it?" Marcus laughed, but not in a mocking way. "Me? I'm just a maintenance guy. I fix air recyclers and replace worn-out gravity generators. I don't think I'm really the type for great power." "But if you were?" Marcus considered the question seriously. "I guess I'd try to make sure everyone had enough to eat. And maybe make it so people didn't have to work themselves half to death just to afford basic necessities. I don't know. I'd probably screw it up somehow." Vera smiled, and, for a moment, Marcus could swear he saw something ancient and vast behind her eyes, like looking into the depths of space itself. "I do not think you would screw it up, as you put it," she said softly. "I think you would do better than you imagine." With that, she walked away, leaving Marcus standing alone in the observation lounge with more questions than answers. He watched her disappear down the corridor, moving with a grace that belied her apparent age, and found himself wondering who she really was and why her questions had felt so important. He had no way of knowing that his simple act of kindness had just set in motion events that would reshape the entire galaxy. All he knew was that he had shared his snack with a lonely old woman, and somehow that had felt like the most important thing he had done all day. Marcus finished his shift rotation and returned to his quarters, a small but comfortable space he had made his own over the past 5 years. As he prepared for sleep, he found his thoughts returning again and again to the mysterious Vera and their strange conversation. Something about the encounter felt significant, though he couldn't quite explain why. Little did he know that across the galaxy, certain very powerful individuals had just received word that their long-absent owner had finally returned. And that she seemed to have taken an interest in a simple human maintenance engineer named Marcus Chen. The stage was set for everything to change. 3 days after his encounter with Vera, Marcus noticed that things on Nexus Prime were starting to get strange. It began with small changes that most people wouldn't have picked up on, but Marcus had spent enough years maintaining the station's systems to recognize when something was different. First, there were the shipments. Normally, cargo deliveries to Nexus Prime followed predictable patterns. Bulk goods arrived on massive freighters every few days. Luxury items came in on smaller, faster ships with expensive security escorts. Military supplies were delivered on unmarked vessels that docked at the restricted bays and unloaded under heavy guard. But, suddenly, there were new ships arriving every few hours. Not just any ships, either. These were vessels Marcus had never seen before, sleek and elegant with hull designs that seemed to bend light around them. They moved with impossible grace, slipping through the station's traffic control patterns like dancers weaving through a crowd. The strange part was that none of them showed up on the official docking schedules, yet somehow they always had berths waiting for them. Marcus first noticed this while doing routine maintenance on the docking bay sensors. He was running diagnostics on Bay 47 when one of the mysterious ships glided past the observation window. The vessel was beautiful, all flowing curves and surfaces that seemed to shift color as it moved. It was unlike anything in the standard ship databases, and Marcus had studied those databases extensively as part of his job training. He tried to run the ship's signature through the station's identification systems, but the computer came back with an error message he had never seen before: classification restricted, authority level insufficient. That was odd. Marcus had level 7 clearance, which was more than enough to identify any normal civilian or commercial vessel. The second thing he noticed was the behavior of the station's senior staff. Director Corvash, the hegemony official who ran Nexus Prime, had always been a calm and collected being. In the 5 years Marcus had worked here, he had never seen Corvash so much as raise his voice. But, over the past 3 days, the director had been practically vibrating with nervous energy. He had called 3 emergency staff meetings, issued a dozen new security protocols, and had been seen pacing the corridors at all hours of the day and night. The security chief, a massive Croton named Thex, was also acting strangely. Thex normally maintained a professional demeanor that bordered on the militaristic, but lately he had been jumping at shadows. Marcus had seen him personally inspecting every new arrival, checking and double-checking identification documents, and issuing orders to his security teams in hushed, urgent tones. Even the civilian population seemed affected. The usual bustling energy of the station's commercial districts had taken on an undercurrent of tension. Conversations stopped when strangers approached. Merchants kept glancing over their shoulders as if expecting trouble. The normally boisterous cantinas had grown quiet, filled with groups of beings who spoke in whispers and kept their eyes on the doors. Marcus might have dismissed all of this as coincidence, but then he encountered Captain Zara Voss. He was replacing a faulty atmospheric sensor in the main concourse when he spotted her striding through the crowd like a force of nature. Captain Voss was a legend among the shipping crews that frequented Nexus Prime. She commanded the fastest freight runner in the Outer Rim, a modified Corellian transport called the Iron Phoenix that could outrun most military interceptors. She was known for taking jobs that other captains wouldn't touch, delivering cargo to war zones and blockaded systems with a success rate that bordered on the impossible. Marcus had met her briefly a few years ago when the Iron Phoenix needed emergency engine repairs, and he remembered her as confident to the point of arrogance, the kind of person who acted like she owned whatever space she happened to be occupying. But the woman who walked past him now looked different. Her usual swagger was replaced by careful, measured movements. Her eyes constantly scanned the crowd, and she kept one hand resting on the grip of the plasma pistol at her hip. What really caught Marcus's attention, though, was her destination. Instead of heading for the freight docking bays where the Iron Phoenix was berthed, Captain Voss was walking toward the diplomatic quarter. That section of the station was restricted to government officials, trade representatives, and other high-ranking individuals. Someone like Voss would never have business there unless something very unusual was happening. Curiosity got the better of Marcus, and he decided to follow her at a distance. He told himself he was just being cautious, keeping an eye out for potential security issues that might affect the station's systems. But, if he was being honest, he was simply too intrigued to let it go. Captain Voss moved through the diplomatic quarter with obvious familiarity, nodding to security guards who recognized her and seemed unsurprised by her presence. She eventually stopped at the entrance to the VIP Conference Center, a luxurious facility normally reserved for high-level diplomatic negotiations and trade summits. Through the transparent aluminum doors, Marcus could see that the conference center was packed with beings he didn't recognize. They weren't the usual mix of diplomats and merchants that normally occupied such spaces. These individuals had an air of authority that seemed to radiate from them like heat. They wore expensive clothing and carried themselves with the confidence of people who were accustomed to having their orders obeyed without question. As Marcus watched from behind a decorative pillar, he saw Captain Voss approach the reception desk and speak quietly with the attendant, a nervous-looking Beltani who kept glancing around as if he expected trouble at any moment. The attendant checked something on his console, then nodded and gestured toward one of the private meeting rooms. That's when Marcus noticed something that made his blood run cold. Standing near the entrance to the meeting room was a figure he recognized immediately, though he had hoped never to see her again. Lady Zarath the Merciless was one of the most feared beings in the galaxy. She controlled a criminal empire that spanned dozens of star systems, dealing in everything from illegal weapons to slave trading to worse things that Marcus didn't want to think about. She was tall and elegant, with pale skin that seemed almost translucent and eyes like chips of black ice. Her species, the Valkyr, were natural predators, and she had never bothered to suppress those instincts. Marcus had encountered Lady Zarath once before, during a hostage situation 3 years ago. A group of desperate refugees had tried to hijack a transport ship docked at Nexus Prime, not knowing that it belonged to one of her lieutenant's operations. Zerath had come to the station personally to deal with the situation, and Marcus had been unlucky enough to be performing maintenance in the wrong corridor at the wrong time. He would never forget the casual way she had executed the refugees, one by one, while explaining to the station's security chief that this was what happened to beings who interfered with her business. The worst part wasn't the killing itself, though that was horrible enough. It was the complete absence of emotion in her voice as she did it, as if she was discussing the weather or commenting on the quality of the station's food service. Seeing Lady Zerath here, now, in the diplomatic quarter of Nexus Prime, filled Marcus with a sense of dread he couldn't quite explain. Whatever was happening on the station, it was big enough to draw the attention of one of the galaxy's most dangerous criminals. And if she was here for the same reason as Captain Voss and all the other mysterious visitors, then something truly significant was about to happen. Marcus was so focused on watching Lady Zerath that he almost missed the arrival of the next group. A delegation of hegemony officials entered the conference center, led by a being Marcus recognized as Admiral Kresh, one of the highest-ranking military officers in the local sector. The admiral was accompanied by a full honor guard of elite soldiers, their polished armor gleaming under the artificial lights. Behind them came a group of beings that Marcus had only seen in news broadcasts and history documentaries. These were Galactic Council representatives, individuals who normally only left their protected enclaves for matters of extreme importance. There was Ambassador Threnody from the Core Worlds Alliance, her crystalline form refracting light in complex patterns. Next to her walked Senator Vex of the Rim Territories, his massive bulk requiring the corridor to be cleared of other traffic. As Marcus watched this parade of powerful individuals file into the conference center, a terrible realization began to form in his mind. This wasn't just some routine diplomatic meeting or trade negotiation. This was a gathering of some of the most influential beings in the galaxy, representing governments, criminal organizations, and corporate interests that normally existed in a state of barely controlled hostility toward each other. The only thing that could bring such a diverse group together in one place would be an event of galactic significance. And the only reason they would all come to a place like Nexus Prime, rather than meeting on one of the major political worlds, would be if they were all answering a summons from someone with the power to command their attention. Someone like the person Marcus had shared his protein bar with 3 days ago. The thought seemed ridiculous at first. Vera had been a tired old woman in worn robes, someone who looked like she couldn't afford a decent meal. But, as Marcus replayed their conversation in his mind, he began to notice things he had missed the first time. The way she had spoken about traveling extensively and tasting foods from many worlds. Her questions about power and responsibility. The ancient sadness in her eyes, as if she had seen civilizations rise and fall. And there was something else, something that had been bothering him since their encounter but which he hadn't been able to articulate until now. When Vera had asked him about power and responsibility, she hadn't spoken like someone who was curious about abstract philosophy. She had spoken like someone who was trying to make a decision, someone who needed to understand how power should be wielded before deciding whether to trust someone with it. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine as the implications hit him. If Vera was somehow connected to this gathering of galactic powers, then his simple act of kindness might have had consequences he couldn't even imagine. But that seemed impossible. What kind of person could command the attention of beings like Lady Zerath and Admiral Kresh? What kind of authority could summon representatives from across the galaxy to a single location? His thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of another group, and this one made him realize just how out of his depth he really was. The new arrivals wore the distinctive robes of the Eternal Order, the mysterious organization that controlled much of the galaxy's ancient technology. They were led by a figure Marcus had only seen in classified intelligence briefings, someone whose very existence was considered a state secret by most governments. Archon Valdris the Timeless was old beyond measure, one of the few beings who remembered the galaxy before the current political structure had formed. She had witnessed the rise and fall of dozens of civilizations, and her knowledge of ancient technologies made her both invaluable and dangerous to every major power in the galaxy. The fact that she had come to Nexus Prime personally suggested that whatever was happening here had implications that stretched back through millennia of galactic history. As the Archon passed by Marcus's hiding spot, she suddenly stopped and turned in his direction. For a terrifying moment, he thought she had spotted him, but then he realized she was looking through him at something else. Her ancient eyes held a recognition that spoke of knowledge far beyond his understanding. So, she said quietly to one of her companions, "She has finally returned. After all these eons, the Weaver has come back to claim what was always hers." Marcus felt his heart skip a beat. The Weaver was a figure from legend, someone who existed more in mythology than history. According to the ancient stories, the Weaver had been present at the founding of galactic civilization itself, helping to establish the trade routes and political structures that still governed interstellar society. But those were just stories, weren't they? The kind of tales that people told to explain things they didn't understand about the past. Except now, watching the most powerful beings in the galaxy gather in response to someone's summons, Marcus was beginning to suspect that those ancient stories might be more accurate than anyone realized. He waited until the Archon and her entourage had entered the conference center, then carefully made his way back through the diplomatic quarter toward the maintenance sectors. He needed time to think, to process what he had seen and figure out what it all meant. But, as he walked through the familiar corridors of his workplace, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that his life had just taken a turn toward something far larger and more dangerous than anything he had ever imagined. He had shared his snack with a lonely old woman, and somehow that simple act of kindness had put him at the center of galactic events that could reshape the balance of power across known space. The question was, what was he supposed to do about it? That night, Marcus lay in his bunk staring at the ceiling and trying to make sense of everything he had learned. Every few hours, he heard the distant vibration of another ship docking at the station, and he knew without checking that it would be another group of powerful individuals responding to whatever summons had brought them here. Sleep was impossible. His mind kept returning to Vera's questions about power and responsibility, and to the way she had looked at him when he answered. There had been something in her expression, a kind of evaluation, as if she was measuring him against some standard he couldn't understand. Tomorrow, Marcus knew, he would have to decide whether to seek out Vera again and demand answers, or whether to keep his head down and hope that whatever was happening would pass him by. It was a choice that would determine not just his own fate, but possibly the fate of the entire galaxy. He had no idea that the decision had already been made for him. Marcus woke to the sound of someone knocking on his quarters door. Not the gentle chime of the automated notification system, but actual physical knocking, the kind that suggested urgency. He checked his chronometer and saw that it was barely 5 in the morning, station time. His shift wasn't supposed to start for another 4 hours. The knocking continued, patient but insistent. Marcus pulled on his work coveralls and activated the door controls. Standing in the corridor outside was a being he had never seen before, but who radiated an authority that made Marcus's instincts scream warnings. She was tall and elegant, with features that seemed to shift between different species depending on the angle from which Marcus looked at her. Her skin had a pearlescent quality that caught the corridor lighting in impossible ways. She wore robes that appeared to be woven from starlight itself, fabric that seemed to contain actual points of light that twinkled like distant suns. "Marcus-chan," she asked, though her voice suggested she already knew the answer. "Yes, ma'am. Can I help you? My name is Lyra. I serve the one you know as Vera. She has requested that you join her for breakfast this morning." Marcus felt his mouth go dry. After yesterday's revelations about the gathering in the diplomatic quarter, the last thing he wanted was to get more deeply involved in whatever was happening on the station. But something in Lyra's tone suggested that this wasn't really a request. "I'm not sure I understand," Marcus said carefully. "Vera and I just met briefly a few days ago. We shared a snack. That's all." Lyra smiled, and the expression transformed her face in ways that reminded Marcus of shifting constellations. "That is precisely why she wishes to speak with you again, Marcus-chan. Your kindness was noted, and its implications are being considered." Implications? Marcus felt a growing sense of dread. What implications could sharing a protein bar possibly have? That, I believe, is what she wishes to discuss. "Will you come?" Marcus looked down the corridor in both directions, noting that it was unusually empty for this time of the morning. Usually, there would be maintenance crews preparing for shift changes, security patrols making their rounds, and early rising merchants setting up their stalls. But, today, the corridors were silent except for the hum of the station's life support systems. "Do I have a choice?" he asked. "Everyone always has choices, Marcus-chan. The question is whether they understand the consequences of those choices before they make them." That wasn't exactly reassuring, but Marcus had spent enough years on Nexus Prime to recognize when he was out of his depth. Whatever was happening here, it was clearly bigger than anything he could handle on his own. His best option was probably to play along and hope he could figure out how to extract himself before things got too dangerous. "All right," he said. "Give me a few minutes to get cleaned up." Of course. I will wait. Marcus quickly showered and put on his best civilian clothes, which admittedly weren't much better than his work gear. As he dressed, he tried to calm his racing mind by focusing on practical concerns. Whatever Vera wanted to discuss, he would listen politely, answer honestly, and then try to convince her that he wasn't the person she was looking for. He was just a maintenance engineer, after all. He fixed things. He didn't get involved in galactic politics or ancient mysteries or whatever this was turning out to be. When he emerged from his quarters, Lyra was waiting exactly where he had left her, standing motionless in the corridor as if she was part of the station's architecture. She led him through parts of Nexus Prime he had never seen before, taking routes that seemed to exist outside the normal layout of the station. Corridors that weren't on any schematic he had studied. Lift tubes that access levels that didn't appear in the station directory. How long have these passages been here? Marcus asked as they walked through what appeared to be a garden pavilion, complete with flowering plants and a small stream, located somewhere in the heart of the station where no such space should have been able to exist. Time is a more flexible concept than most beings realize, Lyra replied cryptically. These spaces have been here for as long as they have been needed. That didn't really answer his question, but Marcus was beginning to suspect that getting straight answers was going to be difficult. He focused instead on memorizing their route, though he had a sinking feeling that the path they were taking might not exist when he tried to retrace it later. They finally arrived at what appeared to be a private dining chamber, elegantly appointed with furniture that seemed to have been grown rather than built. The walls were transparent, offering a view of space that was unlike anything Marcus had ever seen from Nexus Prime. Instead of the familiar star patterns he knew, the vista outside showed swirling galaxies and nebulae that seemed to move in complex, hypnotic patterns. Vera was sitting at a table in the center of the room, but she looked different than she had during their first encounter. Her worn gray robes had been replaced by garments that seemed to be cut from the fabric of space itself, deep blue-black material shot through with silver threads that pulsed like circuits. Her hair, which had appeared gray and thin before, now seemed to contain actual starlight, strands of luminescence that moved with their own inner life. But most striking of all were her eyes. The tired sadness Marcus had noticed during their first meeting was still there, but now it was accompanied by something else. Intelligence that seemed to span millennia. Wisdom that came from watching civilizations rise and fall. And power, vast and ancient power that made the air around her seem to thrum with potential energy. Marcus, Vera said, gesturing to the chair across from her. Thank you for joining me. I hope you slept well. Not really, Marcus admitted as he sat down. I've been trying to figure out what's going on around here. Yesterday I saw some of the most powerful beings in the galaxy gathering in the diplomatic quarter. Today I'm having breakfast with someone who apparently isn't who she seemed to be 3 days ago. Vera nodded approvingly. Good. I was hoping you would be observant enough to notice the changes. It speaks well of your character that you're asking questions rather than simply accepting what you're told. A meal appeared on the table between them, though Marcus hadn't seen anyone bring it. The food looked like it came from a dozen different worlds, dishes he recognized mixed with others that seemed to exist outside normal culinary traditions. Everything smelled amazing, but Marcus found that his appetite had disappeared somewhere between waking up this morning and realizing that the elderly alien woman he had befriended might be one of the most important beings in the galaxy. Who are you? He asked directly. Really, I mean. Not the tired traveler act you were putting on before. Vera took a sip from a cup that seemed to contain liquid starlight, then set it down carefully before answering. I am what your people might call an administrator, she said. Though that term doesn't really capture the scope of my responsibilities. I oversee certain aspects of galactic civilization. I ensure that the systems which allow for interstellar trade and communication continue to function properly. I maintain the Marcus spent the rest of the day wandering through Nexus Prime in a daze, trying to come to terms with the choice that had been placed before him. He found himself gravitating toward the places where he had always felt most comfortable, the maintenance corridors and engineering sections where the real work of keeping the station running took place. In Section C, he encountered his supervisor, Chief Engineer Torres, who was struggling with a faulty gravity generator that had been giving them problems for weeks. Without thinking, Marcus rolled up his sleeves and dove into the repair work, letting the familiar routine of diagnostics and component replacement calm his racing mind. Good work, Chen, Torres said as they finished replacing the failed anti-grav coils. I don't know what I'd do without someone who actually understands these systems. Most of the youngsters they send me these days think engineering is all about pushing buttons and reading displays. They don't get that you have to feel how the machine wants to work." Marcus nodded absently, but Torres's words stuck with him. Feel how the machine wants to work. Maybe that was the key to understanding what Vera was offering him. The galaxy wasn't really a machine, but it was a system, a complex web of relationships and interactions that could either function smoothly or break down catastrophically. And, maybe, just maybe, his years of maintaining the intricate systems that kept beings alive in the hostile environment of space had taught him something about maintaining the even more complex systems that kept civilizations functioning. As the afternoon wore on, Marcus found himself paying attention to the station's inhabitants in ways he never had before. He watched a Zephyrian merchant negotiating with a human cargo handler, both of them working to find common ground despite their vastly different biologies and cultural backgrounds. He observed a group of refugee children from 3 different species playing together in one of the recreation areas, their laughter creating a universal language that transcended their differences. But he also saw the darker side of galactic civilization. In the lower levels, he witnessed a hegemony tax collector extorting protection money from small business owners who were already struggling to make ends meet. In the commercial district, he overheard corporate representatives discussing plans to strip mine an inhabited planet, treating the billions of lives at stake as minor obstacles to profit. These observations crystallized something in Marcus's mind. The galaxy wasn't broken because it was poorly designed. It was broken because the beings running it had lost sight of what it was supposed to accomplish. They had become so focused on accumulating power and wealth for themselves that they had forgotten their responsibility to the people they were supposed to serve. What would happen if someone who remembered that responsibility was given the power to enforce it? As evening approached, Marcus made his way back to the diplomatic quarter, where he could see increased security activity around the VIP conference center. The most powerful beings in the galaxy were gathering to meet with someone they believed could reshape the balance of power across known space. What they didn't know was that their fate might be decided by a maintenance engineer who had shared his lunch with a lonely old woman. Lyra was waiting for him outside the conference center, appearing from nowhere with the same unsettling grace she had displayed that morning. "Have you reached a decision?" she asked. Marcus took a deep breath. "I want to see what happens at this meeting before I decide anything. I need to understand exactly what I'd be getting into." Lyra nodded approvingly. "Wisdom lies in understanding the full scope of one's choices." "Very well. You may observe, though I should warn you that what you witnessed tonight will change your perspective on reality in ways you may find uncomfortable." She led him through corridors that definitely hadn't existed that morning, past security checkpoints where guards looked right through them as if they weren't there. They eventually arrived at an observation gallery that overlooked the main conference hall, a space that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The hall itself was vast, larger than should have been possible given the station's layout. The walls seemed to stretch upward into infinity, and the ceiling showed the same impossible view of quantum space that Marcus had seen during his breakfast with Vera. Floating platforms at various heights provided seating for the assembled delegates, each platform designed to accommodate the environmental needs of different species. Marcus recognized many of the beings he had seen arriving over the past few days. Lady Zerath the Merciless sat on a platform shrouded in shadows, her pale features barely visible in the darkness she preferred. Admiral Kresh occupied a military standard command chair surrounded by holographic displays showing fleet positions throughout the sector. Ambassador Threnodice crystalline form refracted light in complex patterns that served as a form of communication among her people. There were dozens of others, representing every major power block in the galaxy. Corporate executives, crime bosses, military commanders, religious leaders, and political figures who normally existed in a state of barely controlled hostility toward each other. Yet here they sat in the same hall, all waiting for the same person to address them. As Marcus watched, the assembled crowd gradually fell silent. The lighting in the hall shifted, focusing attention on a central platform that had been empty moments before but which now held a simple chair. Vera materialized on the platform, though Marcus couldn't tell whether she had walked there or simply willed herself into existence. She looked different again, though the changes were subtle. Her starlight-woven robes seemed to pulse with energy that resonated through the quantum substrate underlying reality. Her hair moved as if stirred by solar winds, and her eyes held depths that seemed to contain entire galaxies. When she spoke, her voice carried clearly to every corner of the vast hall, despite the fact that she didn't appear to be using any kind of amplification system. "You have been summoned here," Vera began, "because the time has come to discuss the future of galactic civilization. For too long, the systems I put in place to ensure order and prosperity have been corrupted by those who view power as an end in itself rather than a means to serve others. Admiral Kresh leaned forward in his command chair. With all due respect, whoever you are, the hegemony answers to no single authority. Our mandate comes from the people we protect. Vera turned her gaze toward the Admiral, and Marcus saw him shrink back involuntarily as those ancient eyes focused on him. Admiral Kresh, in the past decade, your forces have invaded 17 star systems under the pretext of maintaining order. 12 of those invasions resulted in the complete subjugation of the local populations. 3 led to the extinction of entire species. Is this how you protect the people under your care? The Admiral's face flushed with anger, but, before he could respond, Vera continued. I have the complete records, Admiral. Every order you gave, every report you suppressed, every atrocity you authorized in the name of maintaining hegemony authority. Shall I share them with your fellow delegates? Lady Zarath laughed, a sound like breaking glass. How delightfully dramatic. But surely you don't expect us to simply accept the word of some mysterious figure who claims authority over us all. What gives you the right to judge our actions? In response, Vera simply gestured toward the walls of the conference hall. The quantum patterns visible there shifted and changed, resolving into images that showed the history of galactic civilization in fast forward. Marcus watched as primitive spacefaring societies made their first tentative steps beyond their home systems, establishing trade routes and communication networks that gradually linked worlds across vast distances. But the images also showed something else. At crucial moments throughout history, when conflicts threatened to tear apart the growing galactic community, there had been interventions. Natural disasters that separated warring fleets. Technological discoveries that shifted the balance of power away from aggressors. Resource discoveries that provided alternatives to conquest and exploitation. I have been here since the beginning, Vera said quietly. I designed the hyperspace routes that connect your worlds. I established the quantum communication networks that allow your governments to function across interstellar distances. I created the economic systems that make galactic trade possible. I am not claiming authority over you, Lady Zarath. I am simply acknowledging authority that has always existed. The assembled delegates stared at the historical images with expressions ranging from awe to terror. Marcus saw several of them checking their personal communication devices, probably trying to verify what they were seeing with their intelligence services. But he had a feeling that any confirmation they received would only make Vera's claims more credible, not less. Ambassador Threnodice's crystalline form flashed in patterns that Marcus's universal translator interpreted as urgent questioning. If what you claim is true, why reveal yourself now? Why not continue to guide events from the shadows as you apparently have for millennia? Vera's expression softened, and, for a moment Marcus could see the exhaustion he had recognized during their first encounter. Because I am tired, Ambassador. I have carried this responsibility for long enough, and it is time to pass it to others. But, before I can do that, I must ensure that the systems I created are returned to their intended purpose. She gestured, and new images appeared on the walls. These showed the current state of galactic civilization, with all its inequalities and injustices laid bare. Worlds where beings worked themselves to death to pay taxes to distant governments. Corporate executives who lived in luxury while their employees struggled to afford basic necessities. Military commanders who treated entire populations as expendable resources. This is not what I intended when I helped establish galactic civilization, Vera said, and her voice carried a weight of sorrow that made Marcus's heart ache. I envisioned a community of worlds working together for mutual benefit, sharing resources and knowledge to create something greater than any single species could achieve alone. Instead, you have created a hierarchy of exploitation where the strong prey upon the weak. Corporate Executive Vorth, representing one of the largest manufacturing consortiums in the galaxy, stood up on his platform. You speak of ideals, but the reality is that civilization requires order, and order requires hierarchy. Someone must make the difficult decisions, someone must bear the burden of leadership. If you dismantle our current systems, you'll create chaos that will benefit no one. You're absolutely correct that leadership is necessary, Vera agreed. Which is why I am not proposing to dismantle your systems. I am proposing to transfer control of them to someone who understands that leadership means service, not domination. She looked directly up at the observation gallery where Marcus was hiding, and he felt her gaze pierce through whatever concealment Lyra had provided. Every eye in the conference hall followed her line of sight, and, suddenly, Marcus found himself the center of attention for the most powerful beings in the galaxy. "Marcus Chen," Vera called out, her voice carrying clearly despite the distance. "Will you join us?" Marcus felt his legs moving before his conscious mind had decided to comply. Lyra guided him down to the main floor of the conference hall, through passages that opened and closed around them like living tissue. Before he knew it, he was standing on the central platform next to Vera, looking out at an assembly that could determine the fate of countless worlds. The silence was deafening. Marcus could feel the weight of hundreds of alien gazes evaluating him, judging him, trying to understand how a simple maintenance engineer had become central to their gathering. He was acutely aware of his cheap civilian clothes, his calloused hands, his complete lack of formal education in politics or governance. "You can't be serious," Lady Zarath said finally. "This person is supposed to replace you as the guiding force of galactic civilization? He's nobody. A worker. He has no training, no experience, no understanding of how power actually functions in the real world." Marcus felt his temper flare, and, before he could stop himself, he stepped forward. "You're right," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the hall's acoustics. "I am nobody special. I fix things for a living. I've never commanded armies or negotiated treaties or run corporations." He looked around at the assembled delegates, meeting their gazes directly. "But, I've also never invaded someone else's home because I wanted their resources. I've never sold people into slavery because it was profitable. I've never ordered the deaths of innocent beings because they were inconvenient to my plans." His voice grew stronger as he continued. "You want to know what qualifies me to judge your actions? I remember what it feels like to be powerless. I remember what it's like to work every day just to survive, to worry about whether you'll have enough money for food, to watch the people you care about suffer because the system treats them as disposable." Marcus turned to face Lady Zarath directly. "You call me nobody, but I know what somebody like you has never bothered to learn. I know that every decision you make affects real people with real lives. When you decide to expand your criminal empire, somebody's family gets destroyed. When you choose profit over safety, somebody's children don't come home. Those aren't just statistics to me. They're the reason why power should never be given to people who think they're better than everyone else." The hall erupted in noise as delegates began arguing among themselves. Some seemed outraged by Marcus's words, while others appeared thoughtful. Admiral Kresh was shouting something about military necessity, while Ambassador Threnody flashed patterns that suggested deep consideration. Vera raised her hand, and silence fell instantly. "Marcus has demonstrated precisely the quality I was hoping to find," she said. "The ability to remember that power exists to serve others, not to elevate oneself above them. This is the foundation upon which all legitimate authority must rest." She turned to address the full assembly. "Here are the terms of the new arrangement. Control of the fundamental systems that support galactic civilization will be transferred to Marcus Chen, who will have the authority to modify or replace any governmental, corporate, or military structure that fails to serve the welfare of the beings under its authority." Corporate Executive Vorth stood up again. "And, if we refuse to acknowledge this authority?" Vera's expression didn't change, but the quantum patterns on the wall shifted ominously. "Then, you will discover that the systems you rely upon for communication, transportation, and resource extraction were always mine to give or take away. Test my resolve in this matter, and you may find your fleet stranded between stars, your factories silent, and your bank accounts mysteriously empty." The threat was delivered so calmly that it took several seconds for its full implications to sink in. When they did, Marcus could see fear spreading across the faces of beings who were accustomed to being the ones making threats. However, Vera continued, "I am not interested in punishing past mistakes, only in preventing future ones. Those who choose to use their positions to genuinely serve the welfare of others will find their authority enhanced rather than diminished. The galaxy is vast enough to reward everyone who contributes to its flourishing." She looked directly at Marcus. "The choice is yours. Will you accept this responsibility?" Marcus stood there for a long moment, feeling the weight of countless lives resting on his decision. He thought about all the suffering he had witnessed, all the injustice he had seen but been powerless to prevent. He thought about what the galaxy could become if someone with actual compassion was given the power to reshape its systems. But, he also thought about the loneliness in Vera's eyes, the exhaustion of someone who had carried an impossible burden for too long. She was offering him a gift, but she was also asking him to save her from an existence that had become unbearable. "I'll do it," Marcus said finally. "Not because I think I'm qualified, but because someone needs to try. And if I fail, at least I'll fail while trying to help people instead of trying to exploit them." The transfer of power was unlike anything Marcus could have imagined. Vera placed her hands on his shoulders, and, suddenly, he could feel the quantum substrate that underlay reality responding to his thoughts. Information flooded his mind, not just facts and figures but understanding of how systems connected and influenced each other across galactic distances. He could sense the hyperspace routes that connected distant worlds, feel the flow of resources and information that kept civilization functioning. He could perceive the points where those systems were being corrupted or subverted, where power was being concentrated in ways that served the few at the expense of the many. And, with that awareness came the ability to change things. Not through force or coercion, but through the simple process of making the systems work the way they were supposed to work. Ensuring that trade routes served mutual benefit rather than exploitation. Making sure that communication networks carried truth instead of propaganda. Guaranteeing that resource allocation reflected need rather than political influence. The assembled delegates watched in stunned silence as Marcus gradually straightened, his posture changing as he adapted to the new awareness flooding through him. When he looked at them again, his eyes held depths they had not contained before, though they still retained the fundamental compassion that had led him to share his lunch with a lonely old woman. "The old arrangements are finished," Marcus said, and his voice now carried the authority of someone who could reshape reality itself. "From this moment forward, the systems that support galactic civilization will serve the welfare of all beings, not just the powerful few. Those who choose to work within this new framework will find their legitimate authority enhanced. Those who attempt to subvert it will discover that their power was always more fragile than they realized." He paused, looking around at the faces that ranged from terrified to hopeful to calculating. "But I'm not interested in ruling through fear. I want to build something better, and I'm going to need help from people who remember what leadership is supposed to accomplish. Anyone who's willing to use their position to genuinely serve others is welcome to be part of what comes next." As Marcus spoke, Vera seemed to grow lighter, more translucent, as if the transfer of responsibility was allowing her to finally release her hold on physical existence. She smiled at him with genuine gratitude, and, for a moment Marcus could see her as she truly was, not the tired administrator she had become but the being who had once dreamed of a galaxy where different species could work together for mutual benefit. "Thank you," she whispered, and then she was gone, dispersed into the quantum substrate that connected all things, finally, free to rest after eons of service. Marcus stood alone on the platform, facing an assembly of the most powerful beings in the galaxy, knowing that everything that happened next would depend on the choices they made in the coming moments. Some would try to fight the new order, clinging to the old systems that had served them so well. Others would adapt, finding ways to thrive in a galaxy that prioritized service over domination. But, for the first time in millennia, the fundamental systems of galactic civilization were in the hands of someone who remembered that power was supposed to serve love, not the other way around. And that, Marcus thought as he looked out at the stars visible through the quantum windows, was a pretty good start. The galaxy was about to discover what happened when someone who fixed things for a living was given the tools to fix everything.